You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 119. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Today we want to continue our conversation about leading through storms.
So let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/119. We're going to mention this a little later in this episode, but we've put together 3 conversations to have with your team about building trust that we would welcome the opportunity to facilitate with you over a Zoom call. If you go to the show notes page, you'll find a button where you can click that button and learn more about building trust. And that's really the focus of our conversation today. But before we jump there, Tim, will you remind folks of the scripture that we've been working with as we talk about trust and leading through storms?
Yeah, our conversation's been focused upon Matthew 8:23 through 27. Then Jesus, got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went down and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." And he replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. Today we want to talk about trust and leading through the storm. And, it's trusting that God's in this moment, in the midst of the storm. It's trusting God, trusting yourself. And really, Sara, isn't it about asking him to trust us to guide them?
Yeah, and part of why we want to have this conversation today as we're all navigating this pandemic is at the foundation of every healthy team is trust. I'm going to say that again because I want you to hear what I just said. At the foundation of every healthy team and organization is trust. And here's the thing about trust and vulnerability. They're 2 sides of the same coin. You need trust to be vulnerable, and you need to be vulnerable to trust. One doesn't exist without the other. But you're never going to trust Jesus, yourself, or anyone else without stepping into the emotions that you feel during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So my question for you today is, will you trust being here in the midst of this storm, in the midst of the pandemic that we're all experiencing? It's not a storm that's blowing through in 15 minutes and it's over. This is an extended season that we're experiencing. So being present to God and to the storm, being present to one another, being present to your own emotions and what is happening inside of your soul, those are all areas that we need to trust. So will you trust what is happening all around you and within you as you navigate this storm?
So, Sara, I was just thinking that while there were many people who predicted a pandemic, and there were plans that have been made, whether it was this particular one or not, none of us could have anticipated what's come to be known as sheltering in place or staying at home, or this slow return to normal that we're going through, or just the term flattening the curve. When was the last time you used the term flattening the curve? I mean, we're in a time we've not been in before.
Yeah, so that when you said that, flattening the curve, I can distinctly remember it was March 12th. It's probably a date that's going to be seared in my brain. That was the date that I watched the first press conference from our governor and lieutenant governor and director of public health. And it was the first time I heard that term, flattening the curve. And as we talk about trust, what I'm remembering about that moment is already in terms of what I had witnessed on television from that press conference, there was an element of trust that I had in the leaders that I was listening to because of the clarity that they were offering, the specificity around what they were naming, and how they were describing the situation as they knew it at that moment, helping me to understand what was going on. And it was clear that they knew what they were talking about. While they are our political leaders, our government leaders, there was nothing political or being politicized about the conversation that was happening. They were talking about the present moment. So as I think about that experience, do I know Governor DeWine or Lieutenant Governor Houston or Dr. Acton personally? Absolutely not. But there was still an element of trust that was happening because they are leaders in the state that I live in. So right now, what we would like to do for this episode is invite you to think about one person that you want to develop or deepen trust with. And for the sake of this podcast, Tim and I are going to have a conversation about trust between the two of us to help you begin to think about a couple of attributes of trust that are needed in every situation and in every relationship. And we really want to hone in on the behaviors that we see that for us, and this will just be an example, an illustration for you, that point to that trust. So I think the first one that we're going to talk about is the attribute of reliability. So Tim, do you trust me to be reliable? And it's okay to say no. She's got some work to do on that one.
Reliability would not be one that I would pick that would say, Sarah, you need to work on this.
When you think about reliability, Tim, I know something that I think about that happens each time we go to record a podcast. But is there a behavior that you can think of that I do that points to reliability?
Well, let's just take recording podcasts as an example, and that is we set these days weeks in advance, and we set a time. As we get closer to the day, sometimes the day doesn't change, but sometimes the time does.
Right.
But the part that I can trust in the midst of the reliability is I know what's going to happen. I also know that you're going to provide some script because the podcast isn't going to work if you're going to have me fly by the seat of my pants. So I trust that. I mean, it's because there's a reliability. There's a place where I don't have to worry about coming up the day of and you'd say, well, I'm not ready. We're not going to do this. Even when you don't feel well, we're still working on a way to do it. Doesn't mean that we can't change if we want to, but I can live my life based upon the reliability that I've experienced with you.
Tim just described a scenario, and I'm going to go into coach mode here just a little bit, Tim. What behaviors did you name?
What behaviors did I name?
Yes. Would you like me to tell you what I heard you say?
That would be very helpful.
One of the behaviors was around a written script, an outline, some sort of notes for us to be able to record the podcast from, that there's some guidance for what are we talking about as we come to record. The behavior for me is I prepare something and you receive it. You can count on that happening. The other thing that I heard you say is that for the reliability piece is that I show up and we record when we say that we're going to record. Yes, there's some movement in that, and I'll offer a behavior in a second here around reliability that I have seen us do. But because I show up, there's never been a time that we've said, okay, I'll call you on Skype, and I never call you. That hasn't happened. So that's another behavior. Simply showing up and being present. There's been consistent behaviors there. Another one, this isn't exactly in what you were saying, but because you mentioned the podcast, when I think about reliability, for those of you listening, that every Tuesday there's going to be a podcast episode. Sometimes in between Tuesdays, there are additional podcast episodes. We call those bonuses. But the reliability is that every Tuesday there's a new episode that comes out. And that's a behavior that you experience from Tim and I around this podcast. And that's an example of how you build trust. So part of the reason that we do that and have an episode every week is that we do want you to trust that, there's going to be consistent resources available to you as Christian leaders, especially through this time, that that it's there. If we just disappeared during this and you never heard from us, that would likely impact the trust that you have with us. So I turned the tables a little bit there and changed the trust relationship to the people who are listening to us. But to go back to reliability, Tim, and just give another behavior, there's a lot of communication that happens between you and I when it comes to recording these episodes. Everything from getting it on the calendar, and you mentioned that, to, the week, the day before, the hour before, the half hour before, sending text messages back and forth, because sometimes you get a phone call. Sometimes I get a phone call. Sometimes, something goes haywire with the technology that we're using, and one of us needs to adapt with something. And so we're constantly going back and forth with text messages, with phone calls, with emails of saying, here's where I'm at, this is what I need, and here's when I'll call you. Those are behaviors. Communication is the behavior that demonstrate the reliability. Anything you want to add to that one?
No, thank you. I think, so I said no, and then I'm going to add something. When we ask people to trust us, I think it's fair to say that sometimes when we even record in advance and there's a pandemic, we go back and change what we've recorded because we don't want to be tone deaf.
Right.
We want to be relevant. We want to provide the kind of resources that are needed. And if you can depend on us, then that's developing the kind of trust. There's a reliability that when you hear what we're talking about, it's something that's helpful.
Yeah. So I said that there were 7 different attributes of trust. We're only going to talk about a couple of them today. Tim, do you want to talk about the attribute of generosity and how the behaviors around generosity and how that builds trust? How you've seen that build trust?
Well, I like the word generosity, and the way we usually use it is not the way we're talking about it right now. I've learned a lot about how to be generous with people. We may, in our tradition, call it grace, but the way that I've learned it, even with people with whom I work, is that if somebody does something we don't particularly care for, we usually go to the most negative piece about what's been said or their behavior. My funny way of trying to say it is we make up what we don't know, and so we begin to project. And I think one of the things that we'd want to say in navigating through a storm with different values is that if we can cut people a break, if we can begin to say, wonder why they would say that or act this way. And if we could begin to think about it from maybe their perspective or a different context, then we're allowing people to become more maybe who they need to be as we become more who we need to be. Now, I need to say that I've learned a lot of that from you because you're a very generous person. I mean, number one, you work with me. But the other thing is that there are many times that even with the people with whom we work, that it's easy for me to say, well, this is the why they feel that way, think this way. And you'd say, well, maybe it's this way. And in thinking about it differently, we're giving people an opportunity to be more who they're supposed to be instead of trying to dismiss them very quickly.
I think the generosity that I've experienced between the two of us that builds trust there is the willingness and ability on both of our parts to be able to say, well, what if this was happening? What's a different perspective that you could offer in terms of what is going on? And simply the practice of being able to do that with someone that I do trust, in this case, it's Tim, has helped me to be able, in other circumstances, to be able to say, hang on, I don't like this. Wouldn't have made that choice, wouldn't have communicated that way. But what's the most generous interpretation I can make here? Now, I will be honest with you, as you are listening to this, sometimes when I play that out, I still get to the point that I'm like, yeah, that was just dumb. Bad move. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we don't do what is needed in leadership. So generosity isn't about excuse making and trying to fit everything into, a rose-colored glass so that it looks good. It's about pausing to ask yourself, you know what, is somebody doing the best that they can here? Have I stopped to consider what the most generous interpretation of what is going on? Because if I haven't done that, then I haven't paused to ask both, how am I contributing to the interpretation of this? And what is the reality of the moment? And that's what brings the generosity. And sometimes when you play that out, the answer is, no, they missed the mark on this one. And I can still be generous in that, but the kind and courageous thing to do in that moment is to then communicate that. Miss the mark on this one. How can we do that differently so that we don't do it again?
One of the things that this storm, this pandemic, has brought to the forefront, and whoever thought of it was genius, and that is, we're in this together. And being generous then is that if somebody's not acting the way we think they ought to act in the midst of the storm, what is going on? Because it's not about us and them any longer. It's that we're in this together. And what do we need to do to help one another get through?
You may have seen it as well, Tim. There's an image going around with a boat on it, and it says just that. We're in this together, but we're not all in the same boat.
Right.
And that's a place where generosity, recognizing that there are different boats, and we're going to encounter the choppiness of this and the challenges of this and the peace of this time in different ways. And so how can we offer that most generous interpretation and ask ourselves, is someone doing the best that they can? And often I have found when I ask that question, are they doing the best they can? The answer is yes. I still might not like what they've done, But when the answer is yes, it's not degrading the trust that I have. It's recognizing a human being that is involved in leadership and recognizing that we're all trying to do the best that we can. And when that's happening, I can trust you. And that's our whole point of having this conversation today. Anything else you want to say about either one of those attributes?
Sarah, I've learned so much in regard to the values and behaviors. I'm going to say what I've said before on this podcast. I wish 40 years ago I'd had some resource like this. I wish that I had been able to, just being a follower of Jesus should be enough, but have been able to look at people and be able to love them for who they are instead of for who I want them to be. Or saying if they were different, they would be a whole lot better off. What I'm learning is that I become more who God creates me to be, has created me to be, when I'm able to say, just with your words, are they doing the best they can? This is what I'm learning from them. And that's part of what I understand generosity to be.
Yeah, that's a good word. And so continue to press in on what are the behaviors around that. And so the behavior that we've been talking about is pausing to ask that question. Are they doing the best they can? That's our example of a behavior around generosity. And so let me remind you that trust is built intentionally. And in a storm or in times of uncertainty, we need it and we depend on it. Now, I know for some of you that are listening, you're not experiencing it. And so if you're not experiencing it, or if you are, but you want to deepen that trust, head over to the show notes page, fill out the simple form, and we would love to jump on a Zoom call with you and your team to facilitate a trust-building conversation. We promise that there's not going to be any touchy-feely exercises or do anything that is silly that people will roll their eyes at. We want to help you in this time. And part of why we're not just throwing these activities out and saying, here, go do them, is one of the ways that trust is built is when you participate in that conversation. And you can't participate in the conversation if you're leading the conversation in the same ways. And this is a conversation that you need to participate in. That's why we're offering to help facilitate it for you. So head over to the show notes page at transformingmission.org/119 and go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.